Hey folks, Brian Bledsoe here with you for the first time, kind of giving you a rundown of what I'm expecting as far as the long range forecast is concerned. And for those of you that haven't seen my videos or ever seen me speak, I try to throw as much information at you as possible. And then you can kind of pick and choose what you would like and then bring questions back to me about maybe what you did get, what you didn't get, and kind of how we can help go forward with that. So, but before we go forward, I want to talk about recently, in case in point, the past 30 days here, as far as rainfall is concerned. And I want you to keep this in mind. This does not take into account the majority of the heavy rain that fell on Tuesday night, early Wednesday morning, from the 24th to the 25th of October. So that's especially over southeast Kansas, where there were some places that picked up over 8 to 9 inches of rainfall out of that deal, especially down around Emporia, and maybe even more in some places. But overall, this is kind of a scene of what's been going on, where it's been wetter the farther north you go, and a large part of areas farther south have been drier, and most of Kansas has been generally drier than average until that recent bout of rain that really gave a deluge to the east and southeast part of the area. So that's kind of where we've been around here over the past month or so. And to be honest with you, this is really not all that unprecedented in terms of what we're looking at in this type of a pattern. The main thing that a lot of folks have been talking about now for the past really several months is the El Nino phenomenon. And that area that I have in oval off the west coast of South America with the red arrow pointing to it, that's quote unquote the ENSO region. That's where an El Nino or a La Nina will usually show up. And when the ocean temperatures are warmer than average, like what we have right now, that's where we have an El Nino that's currently in progress. So the thing that I want you to be cautious about, though, with the El Nino is while it can kind of set the table, so to speak, in terms of what our long range weather pattern looks like, there are usually some unexpected outcomes and impacts that go along with every single event. Because while El Nino might kind of set the table, there are other oscillations that come along and work in tandem with El Nino that kind of deliver the meal to the table, so to speak. So I don't want you to just look at the El Nino and say it's going to be this way or it's not going to be this way, because with this particular setup, there can oftentimes be quite a bit of variability, and a lot more variability in our part of the world than what we would get with La Nina, which is usually a much drier type of weather pattern. So let's look at the November sea surface temperature anomaly forecast. You can still see off the west coast of South America all of that orange and red, and that is indicative of the El Nino. And something that I want you to follow is where those darker reds are located. I want you to see how those gradually shift a little bit farther to the west here as we head toward January. And even if we head beyond January and go into February, you can see that things gradually start to go away. So a couple of things that I think are going to happen with this. I think we're going to peak this event out in November, December, January in terms of the warmest sea surface temperature anomalies. And then it's gradually going to start to go away. Now, where that warmer than average water shifts also plays a role in what type of El Nino we will have. Yes, there are different types of El Ninos, and I think that those need to be discussed and actually pay close attention to. So over here on the left side of the graphic here, this is what happens with a traditional or an east-based El Nino. And by east-based, it means the warmest water is over the eastern part of the Pacific Ocean, right there off the west coast of South America. So you can see that in the upper left-hand graphic. The middle graphic over here on the left-hand side, all that blue and purple, that's where our storminess is located. That's where the most active part of the storm track is. And then on the lower left, those are temperature anomalies that are associated with traditional or east-based El Ninos from December through February. So you see it rolls with a cooler than average flavor on the southern part of the country and warmer than average the farther north you go. However, what I think will happen with this is some of that east-based warm water will gradually shift a little farther to the west and probably end up as something like a hybrid that I have here in the middle. And you still see in the middle graphic there, all of that blue and purple. That's still where our most active part of the storm track is, but it's a little broader across the southern half of the country. And you see those temperature anomalies in the middle center on the bottom there show that there's a less chance of it being just warmer than average all over the northern part of the country. Certainly the cooler than average over the southern tier, but less warm over the north tier. The last type of El Nino is called the Modoki El Nino, and that's when the warmer than average water really shifts farther west, and you actually get cooler than average water right off the west coast of South America. I think that that's probably the outlier here in terms of what could happen. But if it were to come to fruition, it still would mean a lot of active weather in the midsection of the country and cold in there too. So really, in the grand scheme of things here, what I'm leaning toward is something in the middle here, which would be average to cooler than average, especially for Kansas and points southward, and also an active storm track moving through that region out there as well. The traditional east-based El Nino analogs. Okay, so when we look at analogs, we're talking about years from the past that kind of match up to what we have going on right now. Again, just looking at the fact that we're dealing with an east-based El Nino. That was 51, 52, 57, 58, 72, 73, 82, 83, and 97, 98. And you can see these are precipitation anomalies. So wherever it's green and blue, that's where it was overall average, wetter than average during that time frame. And where the yellows and the reds are, that's where it was drier than average when you average out all of those years together. In terms of temperature, you can see where the cooler than average was. That's where the green and the blues are. And there wasn't a whole lot of warmer than average stuff on the map for those years right there. It was pretty cool stuff, especially across the west and the southwest portion of the United States. Again, just factoring in a traditional east-based El Nino. When you factor in all recent El Nino years since 1950, and that means east-based, hybrid, as well as Modoki, this is the precipitation anomaly map that you get on the average. Okay, when you average all those years out, you still get wetter than average where you're seeing the greens and the blues, and you still get drier than average where you're seeing the yellows, oranges, and the reds. If we look at temperatures, about what you would expect too. Greens and blues, obviously cooler than average, and that favored basically the southern two-thirds of the United States with that. So just simply factoring in all El Ninos, you would say Kansas, well, yeah, you're cooler than average, wetter than average. That shows up very well as far as history is concerned. The best fit analog year, by that I'm saying where we've had a traditional east-based El Nino, while we've had an overall cold flavor to the Pacific Ocean, that comes to 1972 and 73. So from November through April of 72, 73, that's what happened right there. Where greens and blues a lot wetter than average, and the yellows, oranges, and reds a lot drier than average. You see 72, 73 was very wet from November through April across all of Kansas, the Midwest, and even across the Southeast. The only dry spot was up in the north central and the northwest part of the country. And temperature-wise, again, very chilly across the western part of the country. Most of the central United States was also a lot colder than average. I'm not saying that that's the best analog year. That's why I have a question mark up there. I'm just simply saying that since 1950, there's been 1 year here that is basically matched up with what we have right now. And that was 72, 73. And again, it doesn't match up perfectly. None of these are ever going to, but it's at least the closest one. Another element that we look at here is something called the multivariative ENSO index. Long story short, it factors in a bunch of variables when you look at El Nino and what's going on with the El Nino, and it spits out a number. So since 2002, again, you can see the months of the year there, December, January over here in the middle left, January, Feb, March, April, so on and so forth. It assigns a value. So where you're seeing the reds, that's where El Nino was present. Where you're seeing the blues, that's where La Nina was present. So if we come down here past 2020, look at all the blues. Well, we've had 3 years here where we dealt with largely La Nina-like conditions until recently you see the August-September output put us at a positive MEI value of 0.6. All right. If you look back to the last really strong El Nino we had, that was in 2015. Look at what we had up there. You find that number at August and September, it was at 2.1. What this tells me is that while we have a lot of warm water out there in the Pacific, and we've had an El Nino going on here for a little while, that the atmosphere and the ocean may not be talking together as well as what we have seen in past events. Case in point, back in 2015. And I think that's what needs to give us some pause about this going forward, because when someone says, well, we're in an El Nino, so we see this historically, not necessarily. I think these MEI values are very important when we're analyzing the El Nino, because the MEI kind of generates the overall strength of the event or the impact of the event as far as a driver in our weather patterns going forward. I'm not saying this can't get stronger. It probably will, especially by the time we head into December. But historically speaking, for ocean temperatures that have been this warm in that ENSO region, I would expect to see that 0.6 value a lot higher. Could that have a diminishing impact on this El Nino going forward? It's possible. Could it have a more impactful flavor to the overall forecast going forward? Probably less likely for the reasons that I mentioned right there, but I wanted to draw your attention to that. So the best fit analog years here since 1950, when you kind of match up what the MEI value is right now to past events, when you look at November to April, 2006 and 07, 2009 and 10, that's what happened on average for both of those years. Kansas was largely wetter than average. So was West Texas. There were some drier spots here and there. And then in terms of temperature, it was average to cooler than average right there. And I remember the 06, 07 winter, especially across West and Southwest Kansas. It was not nice. And even in 09 and 10, things were problematic. So if you average all of this out, okay, and just look at El Nino historically, regardless of the type, regardless of the strength or whatever, historically speaking, from November through April, while that event is there, Kansas will see largely wetter than average conditions overall and colder than average conditions. And that's just simply looking at history right there. So I definitely want to give you a look-see at that. Another one of those oscillations, which I think will be driving the bus, so to speak, going forward, is called the Madden-Julian oscillation. This is an oscillation tied to the tropics. And if I had to put my finger on one oscillation dealing with long-range forecasting that is the most important in the 30 to 60-day forecast, it is this one right here, okay? That's really all you need to know. And it has different phases, okay? The main thing that I'm trying to get on this graphic right here is that the MJO right now is stuck in phase 1 over here on the left, phase 7 and 8 here in the middle. Historically speaking, phase 1, 7, and 8 will favor active weather across the west and southwest part of the country, and those storms eject into the mid part of the country and end up being wetter and colder than average conditions while that's present. I'm not saying this is going to persist all winter long, but I am saying that especially when we get into maybe late November and into December, these are going to be some very strong indicators to pay attention to going forward. So when I'm giving you these videos and when I'm sending these emails out, and if I make reference to the MJO doing this, that, and the other thing, this is the oscillation that I'm talking about. And when I'm looking at going into winter and even into spring, and I see the MJO favoring phase 1, 7, and 8, that would lead me to believe that the potential for some pretty active weather coming out of the southwest part of the country is very real. So that's why I wanted to share that with you. Let's look at some computer models here. And these models came out back on October 5th. So we'll get another run in here in a couple of weeks. But this is the November forecast from the Euro seasonal model, okay, where you're seeing the browns, that's where it's drier than average. Greens and blues, that's where the forecast is supposed to be wetter than average. And you can see for November, it basically lights things up along I-35 and eastward, a little bit drier than average, maybe farther west, but nothing to really write home about. If we look at December, it has a pretty active weather pattern in the midsection of the country. Wetter than average conditions certainly favored in December from this particular model. Okay. If we look at January, much the same story, which it stands good reason to say, hey, if we're active in those months and we set up that storm track, we're probably going to be active going forward. And I think that's what we're seeing here in January. Even into February, there may be a little bit of dryness take place there across parts of the midsection of the country, but overall, nothing that is glaringly dry that it would revert back to a period of time where it was much drier than average or favor drought. And then if we look into March, you can see it lights things up in the midsection again. And if we go into April, it's much the same story. And I know that this is a long ways out there, but I wanted to walk you through some of these models here from November through April to drive the point home that while this El Nino is present and while things are working on that El Nino quote unquote platform to drive the long range weather pattern, once that goes away, we have to kind of start thinking about maybe something different showing back up. And by different, I mean the potential for dryness once again. So in terms of just the Euro seasonal model, it is favoring wetter than average conditions across the state of Kansas and colder than average conditions, at least from November through April. Beyond that, we'll have to wait and see how this plays out. But that's what we have to work with right now. When we look at the NMME model, here are the forecast for November. You can see a little drier than average right there across the midsection of the country, but nothing crazy. If we look at December, average to wetter than average conditions across the state of Kansas and some of the surrounding areas. If we go into the month of January, much the same story, nothing glaringly dry, certainly not across Kansas anyway. If we look at February, somewhat the same story, mostly average conditions across most of Kansas during that time in terms of precipitation. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was above average for the reasons that I'd mentioned here before. If we go into March, much like the Euro, above average across all of Kansas and some of the surrounding areas. If we look at April, much above average across the state of Kansas during that time frame. Even if we go into May, we're still seeing very active weather in the midsection of the country. So beyond May, when that El Nino signature is completely gone, and to be honest with you, it's probably going to disappear sooner than that. I am worried about the wetter than average conditions potentially going away during the back half of 2024. I'm not so much worried about dryness in the first half of 24, but the back half of 24, I am. And I think that is something important that we need to recognize. The CFS model, here's another model. Again, for the November, December, January, this is a 3-month time frame. You can see all of Kansas basically showing up as wetter than average, as is the southwest part of the country. If we look at January, February, March, much the same story right there, wetter than average conditions. And if we go to March, April, May, very much wetter than average conditions, especially across the western half of Kansas in the eastern Colorado. So all of these models are kind of on the same page in projecting the wetter than average condition type of setup to last this winter and as we head into the first half of 2024. Okay, so I think that that's something important that we need to look at, especially when you're looking at any type of PRF coverage and where you might set up those intervals. So in summary here, El Nino coupled with that strongly negative cold PDO, that overall cold state of the Pacific, if you will, is pretty unusual. Likely the reason the MEI is not as robust as past events. I drew your attention to that. And keep in mind, every event is different and can produce those unexpected impacts. I really want to drive that point home because a lot of folks just look at El Nino and say it's going to do this. I think that's putting way too much stock in what El Nino produces or doesn't produce in terms of a long-range weather pattern. That's the other point I want to make here, number 2. El Nino is not the only thing driving the forecast bus right now. It's part of it, but those other things, especially the MJO, will inevitably determine what this long-range forecast looks like. How long this event lasts and how connected it will be is still somewhat in doubt. Okay, that's why I brought up the MEI being pretty low considering this event, the sea surface temperature anomalies off the west coast of South America. But this event should at least last through winter. And given the fact that the PDO is quite negative, it makes it easier to return to La Nina later in 2024. That isn't a guarantee, but it is something I've been worried about for a while. And remember, if we go back to that La Nina, the risk for dryness to redevelop in the midsection of the country is something that we have to be concerned about. So kind of the Cliff's notes about this, or the short and dirty version, is the first half of the year, not too worried about moisture. Middle part of the year, I got a little trepidation about that, but later in the year, especially the back, say, third of 2024, I would be more concerned about the potential for dryness setting up right there. That's about all I have for you. I know it's a lot right here. The next video that we were doing will be interactive, so you'll be able to ask more questions, and we can address some of these concerns in a live setting. But if you do have questions or concerns about this, again, you can email me right there. You can text me if you want to at my phone number. That is my cell number. But I really want to stay connected with this, and I really want to get this discussion going so you guys are as well equipped as possible to make good decisions for your clients when it comes to a weather setting. That's all I have for you tonight, folks. Be well, and it is a real pleasure working with you. I'm very excited about what lies ahead for the rest of this year in 2024. Be well.